Hi, my name is Hope Brewstar with PerformLaw, and I'm going to talk to you today about how to calculate attorney profitability. So these are some of the questions that you might be asking and which will bring you to the attorney profitability calculation. Our goal today is that you're able to answer some of these questions by the end of this presentation. So we're going to just do a rough overview of the process of actually calculating attorney profitability. We're going to look at the profit calculation, the formula that goes into it. We're going to look at one of our own example lateral models and talk about how to gather the assumptions for it, what kind of data you're going to need, the revenue calculation that goes into it, the costs. We'll actually look at the details of how you're calculating profit using the revenue and cost data. We'll try to show you how to answer a question. What is the minimum number of hours an attorney needs to work to cover costs? In other words, to break even. And then we'll talk about a few other little things like how to calculate a profit bonus, what are draws and reconciliation, and what are startup costs and other considerations that you might need to take when you're considering a lateral hire. And then we'll just do a little review at the end. So first of all, you're going to identify what questions that you need to answer and what information you're going to need. You're going to collect any data that you need to answer your questions, and you're going to vet it, and some of it you might end up throwing out. It all depends. So to collect the data that might look different depending on the situation, whether the attorney is in your firm or you're considering hiring the attorney, you might need to have a meeting with them. You might need to send them a questionnaire asking them for the data that you need, and so on and so forth. And then you're going to actually do your profit calculation, which looks like this. Everybody knows profit is revenue minus costs, but we're going to break it down even farther for our purposes. It's working attorney collections for the specific attorney that you're dealing with. Subtract their salary, benefits, general overhead, and secretarial overhead, and then that gets you your working attorney profit. Just a note, general overhead is also called indirect overhead. So now we're going to look at our lateral model. I'm going to break it down for you. I'll zoom in a moment here. We model attorney productivity. We subtract out the cost to get profitability. And then we also talk a little bit about the resources that you'll need to hire this prospect. Just keep in mind that the numbers here are an example, and we are also, using this example to show you how to model a situation, but being that it will be a model, it will always be an estimate, not a guarantee of what's actually going to happen. So first of all, you need to gather your assumptions. For our lateral analysis form, the assumptions appear at the bottom. And basically, you're going to want to look through all of these pieces of data here and compare it to what you have and ask yourself, do I actually have all the info I need to even do this calculation? You're going to want an estimate of the attorney's annual collections. If you get to that by calculating their billable value by multiplying billable hours by a blended rate, then that's one way of doing it. If there's another way that you get to annual collections, maybe this attorney deals with a lot of flat fees or contingency fees, then you might need to use historical data or do something else. But in this case, we're going to work with an attorney who bills hours at a certain rate. So just real quick, we use 1,600 billable hours in this example. We multiply it by a blended rate of $225. We get a billable value. We multiply it by a billed realization, which is just another way of saying 98% of what the attorney works actually makes it into a bill. And then the collected realization, we also use 98%, which means that 98% of what gets billed actually gets paid by the client. And we end up with a collected fees amount, this $345,000 number. Down here, we just have a little tidbit about the hours worked and the hours needed to cover the originations that the attorney is going to bring. This is, in this particular example, for this lateral hire, we use an assumption for the originations that they'd bring in. And try to estimate the hours that would need to be picked up by firm timekeepers in order to cover all of the work that this lateral hire would bring to the firm. So in this case, these are the assumptions for this example attorney. We assume that they're going to originate $300,000, that they're going to work 80% of that, that they're going to give 10% of that away to attorneys at the firm and 10% away to paralegals at the firm, which leaves $240,000 in collected fees that this attorney would originate and work himself or herself. And that means that $60,000 would be originated by this attorney and given to others. We estimate that 40%, a 40% profit will be produced from this work that the attorney originates and gives to others. This 40% is an estimate that we actually assume to help us with our model. And then finally at the bottom here we have a billing rate recap. So these are all the billing rates that we use, and again, these are assumptions that get plugged in, so this is information that you would need to collect from a potential lateral hire should they have originations that get worked by a people besides themselves. So if they have an associate that's going to work on some of their files for them, you're going to want that associate's rate, and so on. So I'm going to take a moment here to talk about indirect or general overhead, because the calculation of this is an important part of your costs that go into the profit calculation. So first things first, you're going to want to gather an income statement and identify all of the firm costs that get lumped into overhead. So it's going to be costs that everybody kind of shares, costs that are not incurred by one particular attorney. So that's going to be things like rent, facility fees, utilities, anything like that, general costs. And it would not include, for example, the salary and benefits of a particular secretary that's assigned to a particular attorney. That would be secretarial overhead, and that's separate. Then, step 2, you get your list of employees that you want to calculate overhead for. You use their job title information and their hire and term dates. Their hire and term dates are important because step 3 is to calculate employee FTEs, and all that is the proportion of the year that the person was present. It doesn't have to be a year. You can take an FTE of a month even, but just using the example of a year, if somebody was present for half the year, then their FTE would be 0.5. So that's what an FTE is. Then step 4, you determine the subjective overhead weights for different position categories. So for example, some firms will assign paralegals only a quarter of a full unit of overhead, and meanwhile an equity partner would get a full allocation of overhead. And then attorneys, like associates, might fall somewhere in the middle, like they might get 50% or 75%. Some firms will completely skip step 4 and just give everybody the same amount of overhead, but we recommend stair-stepping. So step 5, you would then determine an individual's percentage of their own category. So if you are trying to determine the specific overhead allocation for one person and they're one attorney out of 8 total, then they would be 1/8 of their entire category, or about, I believe, 12.5%. Then step 6 is you multiply all these numbers together. You multiply the total overhead cost to be allocated by the individual's FTE count, multiply it by their subjective overhead weight, if applicable, and then multiply it by the percentage of their category that they make up. So now we're going to talk about another step in the cost calculation that goes into the overall profit calculation. We're going to talk about, in this scenario, this person receives a formulaic compensation. If you are dealing with somebody who has a base annual salary, then you can even skip this part, because then it will just be easy. You have one flat number that you're using for their compensation, and that's the number that you plug into the salary section of the profitability calculation. But for our purposes here, this person is receiving a formula for their compensation structure. So starting with the red area, that's the section that contains the formula for their compensation. The blue box would be the profit bonus calculation, and the green box would be adding up all of those blue boxes down at the bottom, the 31,000, 108,000, 9,000, 4,000, and 12, and you get their total compensation all the way on the right. So just talking about the formula for a moment, column A represents our example attorney's fees worked but not originated, and they're going to receive, according to this formula, 30% of those fees. And these percents, by the way, the 30%, the 45%, and 15%, are the standard percentages that we use and recommend, but of course different scenarios may call for different percentages. Column B represents fees worked and originated, and they receive 45% of what they collect there, and then for fees that they originate and give away, they receive a referral fee of 15% of the collected fees. This section just talks about how we get to the figures that we show in the orange and the green boxes. You can read that for yourself. And then we get to the actual profit calculation. So in the orange box here, you're going to see the revenue portion of our calculation, and then everything below it is us gradually subtracting out different costs. So the orange box would be the collected fees that we calculated earlier, and then we subtract out their compensation that we talked about over here. So that's the compensation they're receiving for all of the fees that they work. That's the 30% and the 45%. So we subtract that out. We also subtract out an estimated benefit cost. We estimate about 15% of their compensation would be benefits, and that's in addition to that 139,000. That's on top of it. So 15% times 139,723 comes to about the $20,000 figure you see in the orange box. Subtract those two things out, then you get the amount remaining for overhead and profit. Then you subtract out secretarial and other direct allocations, and then you subtract out allocated overhead. And the result would be the working attorney profit before bonus. And you can stop here, or if you intend to give this person a profit bonus, you can keep following along. Plus, we talk about a few other things. Importantly, we talk about how to answer this question: what is the minimum number of hours an attorney needs to work to cover costs? The first thing you need to do is you identify the dollar amount of the total costs that need to be covered. We've kind of already talked about this in previous slides, but that's the general overhead plus salary plus benefits plus secretarial overhead plus whatever miscellaneous things that that particular attorney might need, any expenses that that particular person incurs. Then step 2, you identify the attorney's billed realization and collected realization amounts, or you assume a percentage. We usually use 98% unless you have more accurate information. Step 3, you identify the attorney's blended billing rate. So if you have multiple rates that you're dealing with for different clients, then you would need to come up with a weighted average of those rates, which we kind of talk about a little bit here in the notes. And then finally, you're going to calculate using this formula that I've typed out here for you. So you take the total costs identified in step 1, you divide by 0.98, you divide by 0.98 again, and then you divide by your blended billing rate. And that should give you the minimum billable hours needed for the attorney to break even. Of course, ideally, you don't want the attorney to just break even. You want them to work enough hours that they also turn a profit. But this just tells you the minimum billable hours needed so they don't cost you anything extra. And then everything above that is ideally going to bring in a profit. Now we talk about the profit bonus calculation. So this is optional. This is only if you intend to reward the attorney a profit bonus. But we start off with the amount that we saw earlier. That's the net profit before bonus. Then we recommend subtracting a bonus threshold. This just allows the firm to take first dibs at whatever profit there is before giving any away to the working attorney. Then what's left over is the amount applicable to bonus. That's the bonus pool. We recommend a profit bonus percentage of 20%. That's standard, but you can definitely go lower or higher depending on the scenario. So 20% of the bonus pool is shown here as $4,012. We use a estimate of the benefit costs. I believe that would be the 15% of the $4,012. So you add those two things together, subtract that from the $95,000, and you end up with a net timekeeper profit of $90,448. So that's after you've bonused the attorney. And then finally at the bottom we have $15,000 estimated profit on work given to others. That's using the 40% assumption that I talked about earlier. We're assuming that of the $300,000 in originations, they give away $60,000 of that for other people at the firm to work, and we're assuming that there is a 40% profit on that $60,000. We also subtract out the 15% cut that the attorney receives. So what the firm keeps would be $15,000. And the $90,448 plus the $15,000, that's everything that the firm gets to keep overall from all of the work that the attorney does and all of the work that the attorney originates. Now let's talk about draws and reconciliation. So a draw is like an advance on the attorney's expected compensation in the case where the attorney receives a formula and not an annual base salary. So we usually recommend a 60% draw. So whatever their estimated compensation earned is supposed to be, we recommend that they receive 60% of that up until the reconciliation, which can be semi-annual, it can be quarterly, different firms do it at different times. But whenever the reconciliation is, what you do is you subtract the scheduled draws that the attorney has already received from the total compensation earned, whatever that actually ends up being, once the draw period has ended, once the reconciliation time has arisen. And then what's left over is the net due to the attorney. So that's going to be what actually gets paid out to the attorney. It might actually end up being more or less than what you estimate, depending on how things fall out, and especially considering collections lag, which is another way of saying, especially considering how long it might take for a client to pay out on a certain invoice. So then we also talk about startup costs and considerations. This is specifically with respect to a potential lateral hire. This is not really something that would come up when you're just trying to calculate profitability of an existing attorney at your firm. But we've got recruiting fees, which might apply. So get that information from the attorney if you think they have a recruiter. There's also startup costs, so that's associated with just onboarding the attorney, like for example, buying them a laptop. Then there's collections lag. We usually estimate a collections lag of 33% of the expected collected fees. So that's fees that you can't expect to get right away. But of course, a collections lag could be different than 33%. And we also use that collections lag percentage to estimate our capital needed, which is the amount the firm will have to pay out of pocket before the attorney becomes profitable. So let's just do a little review. First, we talked about how to identify the information that you're going to need to answer your questions and how to go about gathering that information. We talked about how to calculate things like indirect overhead, general overhead, how to make assumptions for revenue, how to estimate compensation and benefit costs, and how to actually go through with the profitability equation. Then we looked at how to cover costs in detail, what you'll need to make sure an attorney breaks even in terms of billable hours. We talked about a specific formula. And then we looked into onboarding costs, and we talked also about one specific way of breaking up attorney compensation into something that's a bit less risky for the firm, in the situation where the attorney receives a formula-based compensation as opposed to just a salary. So I hope that this presentation has helped you and that you have come to the end of this video feeling more knowledgeable about how to calculate attorney profitability and answer some of the questions surrounding it, as well as making a decision on a prospective hire for your firm. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us because the PerformLaw team is more than ready to help you answer any questions you may have or help you make any kind of decisions for your firm.